what's been marked as OUCC Cross-Examination Exhibit 1.
No objection, Your Honor.
Hearing no objection, OUCC's cross-examination Exhibit 1 is now admitted into the record of this cause.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Perez, you have the cross-examination Exhibit 1 in front of you. Unfortunately, these pages are not marked with page numbers, but if you could flip to what is the response to OUCC 2.05.
I'm there.
Thank you. So the question for this data request was a follow-up to a response to 1.16. And the OUCC asked, please provide the correct figures used in the RIM modeling. Do you see that question there?
Yes.
And the response, and you and Mr. Flick were responsible for the answer here, was that the RIM modeling did not use the numbers referenced in OUCC DR 1.16. And then the modeling focused on the values associated with the residential make-ready credit program proposed in this proceeding. As mentioned in the response to OUCC DR 1.16, the values noted were associated with non-residential EV programs not yet completed or at issue in this proceeding. Do you see that as the response?
I do see that response.
Okay. And does the response actually refer to providing the correct figures used in the RIM modeling as the question requested?
The question asks for the correct figures used in the RIM modeling.
Does the response provide the correct figures?
The information provided with the RIM analysis we conducted for the residential make-ready credit program, all of the figures in that worksheet are correct.
Well, that's not indicated in your answer, is it?
So Mr. Flick responded to data request 1.16.
Well, I'm just focused on, let's look at the last line of the response that Duke made that references Duke's response to 1.16, and the values noted were associated with non-residential EV programs not yet completed or at issue in this proceeding. Were you part of the, well, both you and Mr. Flick answered this, were you responsible for that answer?
What the last sentence indicates, which was responded to in 1.16 by Mr. Flick, that means, well, Mr. Flick would really be the best person to respond to that. But specific to how the question was asked, please provide the correct figures. All of the figures we provided were correct.
But does the response say that?
The response says that value is associated with a non-residential EV program, which is not what we presented in this proceeding.
So the values noted, what do you take that to reference? What values are we talking about?
Again, Mr. Flick responded to the question for DR 1.16. The question asked, please provide the correct figures used in the RIM modeling. The RIM modeling has all of the correct figures.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Perez. When we turn on over to the next page of the document, this is Duke's response to OUCC DR 4.02. So this question references the charger demand kilowatt. And the answer that Duke previously provided, it says, please confirm or deny the charger demand kilowatt shown in response to 1 were not used in the RIM calculations contained in confidential OUCC DR 3.4a. You are listed as the witness responsible for answering this. Is that correct?
I am, this response was done by me or at my direction, correct?
Okay. So Duke, or you personally, confirmed that the company's response was not used in the rate impact measure calculations. Why did Duke provide charger demand kilowatt information that was not used in its RIM test?
We were responsive to the question that was asked. I don't believe I have a copy of the question of 4.1 here.
Well,
So I can't speak off of memory. But, you know, the way we responded to these questions and the reason why we provided them was because OUCC asked the question.
well, you see the response that you made. The charger demand was not used in the RIM calculations. So would you agree that means that Duke provided the OUCC with information that was not used in its RIM test?
Objection, Your Honor. Ms. Hitz is asking questions about a data request that's not in front of the witness. So I think it's a little misleading to try to get her to confirm or deny something that she just testified to, that she doesn't have a recollection as to what 4.01 actually was. So with that, I would ask that the question be either rephrased or we move on.
Your Honor, I asked about this response and asked her whether it was correct that it meant that Duke had provided information to the OUCC that did not apply to the RIM test. The RIM test being one of the central measures by which Duke's requested relief is being judged. I don't think I need, DR 4.01 is really not at issue any more than just that was the initial predicate for the question.
How I'm interpreting your question is you're asking her to confirm that this answer is correct. Is that right? That this answer to this data request is accurate. Is that how am I misinterpreting you?
I'm asking her to answer whether the inference that is raised by their response is correct. My question, does this mean that Duke provided the OUCC with information that doesn't actually apply to the calculation that's central to this case?
Your Honor, I would just further state that that sounds like a question that can't be answered because the data request that is referring to is not here, and the witness just testified that she does not recall what the actual wording of 4.1 is without it being in front of her.
All right.
I'll move on, Your Honor, but I believe that the witness is withdrawn. If you would turn to the last page of CX1, and this request, which is DR 4.04 to Duke, refers to requests a copy of the Charge Florida 2020 report discussed in the Tech-to-Tech meeting that occurred between the OUCC and Duke on July 31st, 2024. Were you part of that meeting?
I was part of the Tech-to-Tech meeting on July 31st, 2024, correct.
And in response, Duke provided a copy of the Charge Florida 2020 report. Do you recall whether that was the interim or final report?
I do not. I believe it may be the interim report. However, we did provide both the interim and the final reports. So I'm just unsure which
Okay.
one was provided at this point.
I want you to turn back, if you would, to your direct testimony.
Direct testimony.
Just generally speaking, would you agree that Duke's request in this case, no, strike that. Let me mentally rephrase. The income that Duke will receive from the chargers that would be subject to the Make Ready credit. Okay, so you've got an incentive to install a charger that Duke is going to provide to put the wiring in to pay for the contractor, right?
Okay.
Or is that a yes?
I'm not sure what I'm saying yes to.
All right. I'm just trying to set up the question.
Okay.
So Duke will receive income as a result of those chargers being installed, correct?
Mr. Flick really is the person that can discuss revenue components pertaining to the Make Ready credit program.
All right. Ms. Perez, I'm not asking about any aspects. I'm just asking about Duke will get revenue, right?
There is incremental consumption associated with EV charging.
Okay, and that results in Duke receiving revenue, correct?
Again, Mr. Flick really will be the best person to talk through revenue. There is an incremental consumption associated with EV charging from the Make Ready credit program.
Well, Duke isn't giving energy away for free as a result of this program, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so it's charging for the electricity.
It is the incremental consumption, correct.
All right. And on page 17, you talk about how the Make Ready credit is
I
cost-effective.
apologize, Ms. Hitz. I have to go to page 17 of my testimony. Bear with me.
And I'm specifically looking at the question that begins on line 6 and the answer that goes down to line 11. If you would read that over, you don't need to read it out loud. And just let me know when you're done.
I'm on page 17. Which lines again?
6 to 11.
Okay. I finished reading.
Okay, good. So therefore, you confirm in this area of your testimony that the consumption will add to revenue.
This pertains to the RIM test, where the benefit of the RIM test is the incremental consumption associated with EV charging.
Okay, yes, thank
Yep.
you. So the incremental revenue that Duke receives Duke will not be using that incremental revenue to offset the costs of the Make Ready credit. Is that correct?
Ms. Hitz, Mr. Flick will be the best person to discuss any offset to credits or revenues. He would be the best person to respond to that.
Well, do you know?
I do not.
Give me just a moment, Your Honor.
Let's go off the record.
I can ask you to turn to your.
Wait a second, hold on. Let's go back on the record.
I'm so sorry. I should know better. If I can ask you to turn to your rebuttal testimony, please.
I have my rebuttal testimony.
Okay. So near the bottom of page 5, carrying over to 6, you note that the OUCC asked in data request 1.16, which is attached to your testimony, about a per participant kilowatt demand number that was included in Mr. Flick's confidential work paper 2-RAF. Do you see that there? Lines 16 and 17?
That is in my testimony, correct?
And Duke's response to the request was that that number was inadvertently included in Duke's testimony. Is that correct?
It is. However, I will point out that, oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
No, I mean, you verified that it was, all
Yes.
right? So then, Your Honor, may I ask that the witness be provided with Mr. Hazelden's testimony, his attachments, JEH1?
Yes, let's go off the record.
I think it's an attachment, so it may be. Okay, that's fine.
I guess if there's any chance of any of this stuff is confidential, that will be in testimony, just let me know so we can go
Yes.
in camera. Okay. Amy, you ready?
All right. Actually,
Hold on. Okay, let's go back on the record.
So the attachment to the public version, or either version, Mr. Hazelden's testimony, attachment JEH1, page 15.
I'm there.
Okay. So that confirms that, and that's also referenced in CX1. The values noted were associated with non-residential EV programs, right?
So it's the same data request that was shown earlier.
Yes.
And I would need to refer back to 1.16.
That's okay.
Okay.
In your rebuttal testimony, the OUCC again asked in their DR 3.1 what value was modeled in the RIM test, and Duke stated it was 3.3 kilowatts. It's
All
on
right,
page
so-
6 of your rebuttal testimony, lines 1 and 2.
Okay.
Do you see that there?
Yes.
And you go on to say that 3.3 kilowatts is the revenue associated with the anticipated build demand. Do you see that?
I see it. It is in my testimony.
Please explain how the 3.3 kilowatts is associated with revenue.
So the 3.3 kW is the build is the kW anticipated for a level 2 EV charger. However, I will note that the 3.3 the residential rates are not based off of consumption. I'm sorry, are not based off of demand. They are based off of consumption. So this number is responsive to the question asked by the OUCC, but this is not a required input within the RIM analysis because revenue for residential customers are not based on demand.
All right, thank you. I would ask if the court reporter could provide the witness with Duke's Exhibit 8.
Let's go off the record.
Do you have,
Wait, let's go back on the record.
oh, sorry. Do you have what's been marked as Duke's Exhibit 8?
Yes,
All right. And those are responses by Duke to the OUCC's 8th data request. Is that correct?
that is correct.
And in response to DR 8 dash or 8.01, in the answer, let me just get down to the right line. It is the fourth line, beginning at the end of the fourth line. The company would also underscore and continue to emphasize that the kilowatt output of an individual level 2 EV charger as a standalone number and as it relates to the billing demand has no relationship to the RIM analysis since residential rates are based on kilowatt hour consumption, not kilowatt demand. Now, you're criticizing Mr. Hazelden throughout your testimony. Are you arguing that Mr. Hazelden believes there's demand revenue realized in Duke's residential rates, that would affect the RIM test?
Can you repeat your question?
Yeah. Based on the response, which you and Mr. Flick made, is it your position that witness Hazelden believes there's a demand revenue realized in Duke's residential rates, and that would affect the RIM test?
I can speak to my understanding of Mr. Hazelden's RIM reanalysis, and the way Mr. Hazelden plugged in the KW output within the RIM analysis is incorrect. I can't speculate whether he assumed that as the billing demand.
Well, in response to DR 3.01C, let me double check, make sure that's in the record. Okay, it is part of Mr. Hazelden's attachments, page 16 of 32.
I'm there.
So in response to DR 3.01C, which again, you were the responsible witness, it states the 3.3 kilowatts was modeled in the RIM analysis, but in your testimony at line 3, and this is on page 6 of your rebuttal, you say the number was not used in the RIM analysis because residential EV charging is based on consumption and not demand. Is that right?
It is correct. However, what I will point out is the reason why we show it as the per participant for the Make Ready Credit program for all years modeled in the RIM analysis is because the 3.3 kW relates back to the consumption, the incremental consumption used to calculate the RIM analysis. So the consumption relates to the demand, and the consumption, which was used in the calculation, that was modeled for the RIM analysis.
In your response to 3.01B, Duke provided a confidential attachment for the total demand increase for Duke Energy Indiana's system by year. Do you see that there?
I see the response to my question. I don't have the attachment.
That's fine. Do you have Mr. Hazelden's confidential material?
I do.
For you? It is I may have just a moment, Your Honor. I got to figure out what page this is on. If I may have a moment, Your Honor.
Sure, let's go off the record.
Your Honor, if we can go off the record just a moment. I have to find the page before I can direct the witness to it. Your Honor, we can go back on the record. I can't find it at the moment, so.
All right, let's go back on the record.
Going back to the July 31st Tech-to-Tech meeting, do you recall that the 3.3 kilowatt number was discussed?
It was discussed based on the questions that was provided prior to the tech-to-tech.
Would you agree that at that time, Duke, members of Duke staff, may not have been you personally, stated that it was a weighted average of kilowatt demand associated with existing residential customers and new construction customers?
It was a weighted calculation based on the forecasted participants of the residential Make-Ready Credit program.
And without revealing those numbers because they're confidential, that's how the two, so it was residential and new construction customers, each of which had a kilowatt associated with those classes, right?
It was a weighted average calculation based on
Okay.
the forecasted participants.
All right. And in response to DR 4.2, which is page 19 of Mr. Hazelden's public.
Okay.
So you confirmed that the 3.3 kilowatt hour was, or kilowatt number wasn't used in the RIM modeling, which was in contradiction to what you said in your response to DR 3.01, correct?
No, that's not correct. And bear with me. Let me make sure I have 3.01 in front of me, as well as 4.02. Okay. So again, the 3.3 kW is responsive to the question asked by the OUCC, which is what the anticipated demand increases for the Duke Energy Indiana system. This number is not an input. This specific number is not an input in the RIM analysis.
Well, let me just stop you. When you say this number, what number are you referring to?
The 3.3 kW is not an input in the RIM calculation analysis because this is a kW that's associated with the incremental EV consumption and is a billed demand revenue, which is not a calculation for the benefits of the RIM analysis.
So in response to 3.01, the OUCC asked for the average demand increase kilowatt due to the Make-Ready Credit program per participating customer by year. And the response was the average demand increase per participant for the Make-Ready Credit program is 3.3 kilowatts for all years. Do you see that there?
I see that as a response to 3.1A. A, Apple.
So that identified the charger demand kilowatt, right?
The 3.3 kW is the anticipated demand for the Make-Ready Credit program. That is not a number that's comparable to a nameplate level 2 EV charger.
I understand that. Then explain to me what the 3.3 kilowatts represents when you're calculating the rim test.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. This has been asked and answered. The witness has stated repeatedly that the number in question has been, was a response to the question that OUCC asked in data request, and that it was not an input to the rim test. So if she wants to rephrase the question, I think she could do that, but the question as answered, I think has been asked and answered numerous times.
I will move on, Your Honor. If you turn to Mr. JEH 1, page 23, which requested a link or document showing the market availability of a level 2 charger of 2.52 kilowatts or less. Do you see that question there?
I do see that question was asked in this data request.
And your response was that this value represents the diversity of EV charging demand. When you say diversity, are you referring to the different types of electric vehicles?
The diversity of EV charging is meant to represent what the KW impact is for the Make Ready credit program, not the type of EV chargers.
Well, how does diversity, let me just back up. As I understand the word diversity, it means things of different types. A diverse collection is multiple things. They are not identical. They are different. So the diversity of EV charging demand with a customer's non-EV related service. Explain the diversity in an EV charging demand.
Specific to this question, the diversity of EV charging demand is meant to state that the 2.52 kW, in every hour when you charge an EV, it doesn't give you the same kW. There is diversity with regard to EV charging in that the level 2 EV charger is smart enough to know and maintain what EV is required. So this calculation is really meant to understand what the anticipated bill demand is for the Make Ready credit program. It is not the nameplate.
Could you stop just
sure.
one second? Is that bill, B-I-L-L, or build?
Build, KW demand revenue, or the KW demand anticipated for the Make Ready credit program.
All right, so in other words, I plug my car in, it is not going to be getting 2 kilowatts per hour at all times. That's just an example. Is that what you're referring to with diversity?
I'm sorry, you said you pulled up your car in?
No, I plugged
Plugged.
my car in.
Okay, yes. When you plug your car in, and again, this 2.52, that is not a nameplate EV charger. That is meant to represent what the total average per participant demand would be from the Make Ready credit program.
Okay, now that we've established that, but you state that this value represents the diversity with a customer's non-EV service.
Mr. Flick and I addressed this question. I don't believe I understand what the customer's non-EV related service really means.
So When you were given this question to answer, you worked with Mr. Flick.
I did.
Did you authorize this answer?
I read this with him too, correct?
So you are one of the witnesses that can answer questions about this, right? You and Mr. Flick. You didn't understand what that meant when you answered it?
I can't speak definitively what Mr. Flick or I may have meant with a customer's non-EV related service. I do know that from a 2.52 kW, that is the anticipated demand for the Make Ready credit program.
Well, we have a brief, just a brief pause, and you need to leave, Mr. Wells.
Yes, I do.
Let's just go off the record for a second. All right, well, hold on, let's go back on the record real fast. Let's take a brief break till about 11:10. Is that good enough time, Amy? 11:15, okay, we'll take a break till 11:15. We're off the record, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. go back on the record. Ms. Hitz.
Thank you, Your Honor. If you could turn to page 13 of your rebuttal. It is.
I'm there.
And you are responding from lines 9 down to the end of the page that the company was responsive to all data requests. Would you agree that the Duke, the Charge Florida Duke, did not provide to the OUCC until after the July 31st tech-to-tech report?
The Charge Florida, so I'll make a distinction between the Charge Florida report as well as the data points that's responsive, that inform the design of the Make Ready credit program. It's only the data points from the Charge Florida program that is pertinent to the proceeding. So the Charge Florida report was provided when the question was asked with regard to what were the underlying information that supported the information and the data that was used to inform the design of the program.
All right, and that was after July 31st, correct?
That was when the question was asked, correct?
And you recall that we went over Duke's responses to OUCC's data request number 1. Do you recall that?
Do you mean like 1.1 or the entire data request set 1?
Do you recall our discussion around data request number 1?
Sure.
Okay. And do you recall that the OUCC asked for all underlying data in that first data request? All the underlying data that Duke had used for its MRC credit program.
All of the information was provided, correct?
And when you say all of the information was it provided in Duke's case-in-chief filing? I don't believe it was.
Objection, Your Honor. I believe this has been asked and answered repeatedly. It's been clear in the record already that the OUCC has had complaints with the data requests, responses of Duke Energy. There were 2 extensions of time requested and granted to their testimony. So I believe this is duplicative, and it is already reflected in the record that they have not liked our responses to data requests and had to ask more.
I can move on, Your Honor. I was attempting to get around to a follow-up question. In your rebuttal testimony, you discuss the 2.52, I believe, kilowatt average electric vehicle related billing demand. That was in response to DR 6.03, page 23 of JEH 1.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm there.
All right. And the response goes on to say that the number, that 2.52, is a reduction from a nameplate value of 40 amps at 240 volts, correct?
Where does that say reduction?
can't find the reference. In response to DR 8.01, which you have before you as Duke Exhibit 8, you make reference in 8.01 to the response to DR 6.03, which is what we were just looking at it. And that was used to calculate the additional revenue associated with the incremental kilowatts. What I'm trying to get to is that the value Duke placed on this was 9.6 kilowatts, correct?
You lost me, Ms. Hitz.
In response to 8.01, the kilowatt output of a level 2 nameplate charging equipment that is approximately 40 amps and 240 volts is 9,600 watts or 9.6 kilowatts.
I'm going to object again, Your Honor. This data request has already been entered into the record as Petitioner's Exhibit 8. I don't see value in having Ms. Perez confirm that that is what the data request already states. It's already in the record.
I'm trying to ask questions around it, Your Honor, and given the prior discussion where there has been some resistance to admitting X, Y, or Z, I'm simply reading this.
Okay, well, if you have a question about it, ask the question about it.
In response, let me back it up. The 9.6 kilowatts is reduced to 6.4 kilowatts to account for diversity. In other words, you have a value of 2.52 and you have a 6.4 for new construction. Do you remember that? That's how you get to the 3.3.
So they're not an apples to apples comparison. This sentence is responsive to the question asked by OUCC, which is state the KW equivalence of the level 2 nameplate charging equipment. So we did the math, and that math produced the result of 9,600 watts or 9.6 KW.
All right, thank you, I appreciate that. I'm talking about the weighted average, which was from the diversified incremental loads, 2.52 kilowatts and 6.4 kilowatts. That's how you got to the 3.3.
These are two separate data requests?
I understand that, Ms. Perez. I'm asking for your verification that that's the 2.52 and 6.4 were averaged. It was a weighted average. That's how you got to 3.3.
The 3.3 kW was a weighted average of the anticipated demand for the forecasted participants of the program.
You compared the numbers, well, let me strike that. Mr. Hazelden came up with a number of 10.5 kilowatt nameplate diversified, which then resulted in him coming to a 2.5 kilowatt value. Do you remember that?
I think Mr. Hazelden would be the best person to respond to his testimony.
I'm asking you if you recall that he came to that conclusion, 2.5 kilowatts.
I know he has the 10.5 kW as the nameplate of the level 2 EV charger, multiplied 25% assumptions on participants, and then arrived at that number and plugged that value within the RIM worksheet.
Well, his result then comes down to 2.5 kilowatts, and that's not that different from what Duke came to, 2.52. Is that right?
The numbers are different. However, we're not comparing the same numbers here. These are not
Okay.
apples to apples comparison.
Why didn't Duke use the 3.3 kilowatt average value times the cost per kilowatt year for generation to reach the capacity costs?
So the 3.3 kW is the billed demand revenue associated with the Make Ready Credit program. It is not an input required in the RIM analysis because the RIM analysis specific to the benefits only looks at kWh consumption. The number with which Mr. Hazelden plugged into the RIM equation is not an accurate apples to apples comparison. So that would make his analysis incorrect. And I'm not, the
Okay.
reason why I'm not able to,
That's
it's not,
fine.
oh, okay.
What was the value for the kilowatt demand used in the RIM modeling?
I don't have the number in front of me. However, it was,
Would it be 0.22 kilowatt?
that would be the number at the coincident peak demand value that's used to calculate what the anticipated supply side cost of capacity is as the cost within the RIM analysis.
So the value for kW demand used in the RIM modeling is 0.22 kilowatt, yes or no?
That is the value that's used for RIM analysis, but it is not comparable to the 3.3 kW.
I'm not asking about those things. Thank you.
Yeah, you all need to stop interrupting her when she's answering and stop talking to each other for the court reporters. Thank you.
So can you explain the 0.22 kilowatts as compared to the 3.3 kilowatts that you used, the difference in the orders of magnitude? Can you explain that?
I can, and it may help if I take a step back and really identify the RIM test associated with a load growing activity such as the Make Ready Credit program. So the RIM test for a load growing activity looks at the incremental revenue associated with the incremental consumption of the Make Ready Credit program as the benefit versus the cost to run the program, including implementation costs, incentives, as well as the cost to serve the incremental load, which is the supply side cost of energy, supply side cost of capacity, and the supply side cost of transmission and distribution. How the supply side cost of capacity is calculated in the RIM analysis, which is specific to this discussion because that is where Mr. Hazelden plugged in his input in the RIM analysis, that is meant to identify what incremental supply side cost of capacity would be with regard to the Make Ready Credit program. And that's different from the billed demand revenue that is associated with the level 2 EV charger. The way they were arrived at from a calculation perspective is different.
Well, are you familiar with Duke's annual filing showing what the cost, the calculation of cost to new entry or cone calculation?
I'm familiar of the filing, but not how it was calculated or how it is calculated.
And, all right, but that is a calculation to determine how much it would cost if you had to put this resource into the market, what it would cost. And every year Duke files a number it supports its calculation. Why didn't Duke use that number?
You have to identify what that number is.
The number, the cost of new entry number.
I don't know what number you are referring to. I apologize.
It's called cone. cost of new entry calculation. That's the filing that's made.
I'm going to object. I also have no idea what the cone filing is, so I'm not able to follow along with this line of cross-examination, and perhaps we could use some clarification.
So the filing in your rebuttal testimony, page 12, the impact, and this is line 14 down to the end of the page. What is the impact to the RIM analysis if the calculation is updated to the value identified in that 30-day filing? That is the 30-day filing I'm discussing.
Okay.
But that is not the value that Duke used in its filing, did it? Was it?
So specific to my testimony, we did provide an explanation on why we did not use that filing, and really it boils down to timing. Based on when the filing was approved, based on when we designed the program, the timing worked out in such that we would go with what was most recently approved, which would be in cause number 45803.
And so you used a number for the purposes of demand-side management and energy efficiency, is that correct?
I'm not sure what that, I don't understand the question.
On that same page, starting on line 11, the company used information in the most recent portfolio filing available in cause 45803 for the 2024-26 EE/DSM. So energy efficiency, demand-side management.
And that's specific to the dollar value associated with the cost of capacity.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Just go off the record. You ready to go back on the record? Ready to go back on?
Yes.
Okay, let's go back on the record.
Ms. Perez, if you know, where did the .22 calculation that we just discussed, where did that come from?
Sure. So the 0.22, let me backtrack. I explained earlier how the RIM calculation for a load-growing activity such as the Make Ready credit program is derived. The 0.22 is the value that's associated with the cost to serve the incremental EV loads, and that is calculated by utilizing the consumption for incremental EVs based on information from other Duke Energy jurisdictions, multiplied by the overall EV residential charging behavior load shapes, and that gave us load shapes. And the 0.22 is specific to the coincident peak demand associated for Indiana, and that was used in the calculation for the analysis.
Were you familiar with the Duke Florida report before it became part of the analysis in this case?
Not necessarily. I'm familiar with the report, yes.
Okay. And would you agree that in that report, there were multiple different types of electric vehicles that made up the, so for example, there were fully electric, there were, hybrid electrics. So there were a variety of different vehicles that were part of that project. Do you remember that?
Do.
And do you remember that some of those vehicles had different usage patterns?
So the Make Ready Credit program is, again, a program that's associated with the wiring and circuitry. It is actually agnostic to the type of vehicle that's being charged, which is how data points from other Duke Energy jurisdictions is important for us to be able to understand what the incremental consumption is associated with EV charging.
Well,
That
go ahead.
and that encompasses all activities related to overall EV residential charging, including the different types of vehicles.
Well, this program proposes a level 2 charger, correct? And that is the single type of charger that is being proposed.
The, again, the EVs is different from a level 2 EV charger. And I'll make a distinction as far as the program was designed with data points from the Charge Florida report. So only some of the data points and only data points that's specific and applicable for the design of the program, including level 2 EV chargers and the consumption associated with that.
Well, Ms. Perez, so if you have a program that has different parameters and you only take some of the data, it's not an apples to apples. Isn't that correct?
The Charge Florida program is not the same program we're filing for Indiana. That Charge Florida program is not a Make Ready Credit program, which is how specific data points that's applicable from those participants within Florida, North Carolina, even for the off-peak charging, is what was used to inform the design of the program.
Well, Duke used the load shape from the Florida study to use in the Make Ready Credit, correct?
Duke used the load shapes that from the participants of the Florida program, specific to what's applicable for the Indiana Make Ready Credit program.
So was there some differentiation between the data? You took some category of vehicles out? You said it was only part of the data. Am I understanding you correctly?
We specifically focused on the level 2 chargers, and that would be specific to what is proposed. And again, the data points from that program is, some of the data points from that program is what was required to be able to inform the design, inputs, and analysis of the program.
How does the 3.3 kilowatt capacity value translate to costs?
I'm not sure what you mean by translate to costs.
How does it apply?
So the 3.3 kW is the build demand associated with the Make Ready Credit program. It is not an input to the RIM analysis.
How does it relate to costs if it's not part of the RIM analysis, and the RIM analysis is the only thing that's used to determine costs?
So the RIM analysis is a benefit cost analysis that determines whether the benefit of the program versus the cost to run the program creates downward pressure on rates. I'm not sure what you mean by costs.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned downward pressure on rates. So Duke is asking that the revenue be placed in a regulatory asset and then wants to earn a weighted average cost of capital, or WACC, on that regulatory asset. Is that correct?
That would be a question for Mr. Flick.
You don't know how the rate recovery is to be achieved if the commission grants this request?
Objection, asked and answered. She's already stated that Mr. Flick is more knowledgeable about the rate making, and questions about regulatory assets or cost recovery should go to him.
I simply asked if the witness knew. I did not ask her to explain anything other than that.
The objection is sustained, I agree. She's already answered that question.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor.
All right, let's go off the record for a second. Sorry, what did I just miss on the schedule? For a reply, okay. So you don't, OUCC, you just have to wait until you see it to determine how. Oh,
I think I don't have my schedule in front of me, and I know that we have a number of filings that are kind of colliding, but I believe early-ish December.
so like 3 weeks maybe? Actually, hold on just 1 second. Linda, are you ready to go? Let's go back on real quick so I can dismiss. Okay. Let's go back on the record. Ms. Perez, we don't have any additional questions, so you're dismissed. Thank you. All right, let's go back off the record.
Okay.
The 6th work okay for OUCC?
Yes, that's fine, Your
Okay.
Honor. Thank you.
All right, so I guess whenever you're ready, Linda, we'll just go back on. You ready, Linda? All right, let's go back on the record. The parties have stated off the record the proposed order schedule is approximately, is Duke plans to file on or before November 8th. The OUCC will file on or before December 6th, and Duke plans to file a reply on or before December 19th. Anything else from Duke
No, thank you, Your Honor.
or from the OUCC?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
All right, we'll take this matter under advisement. This hearing's adjourned. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Linda.